How do you build the most lethal counterterrorism unit in human history? You start by admitting that someone else has already solved the problem, and that the solution has been sitting in a British barracks in the English countryside for decades, while your own generals refuse to look at it. That is not a comfortable truth for the most powerful military on Earth to swallow. It took 2 near-fatal wounds, a catastrophe in the Iranian desert, and 1 Green Beret captain who turned down the Green Bay Packers to join the Army, and then spent the better part of 2 decades trying to make his country understand what he had witnessed on a summer afternoon in Hereford, England. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments which Special Forces unit you believe is the greatest in the world, because what you are about to discover will challenge whatever answer you just gave. Stay until the end, because the connection between a quiet barracks near the Welsh border and every elite counterterrorism unit operating on this planet today is a thread that has never been properly pulled until now. The morning of September 5th, 1972, was supposed to be an ordinary day at the Olympic Games. The Munich Games had been deliberately designed as a celebration of the new Germany, peaceful, open, festive, as far from the specter of 1936 as a nation could engineer. Then, at 4:30 in the morning, 8 men climbed a fence. They were not athletes. They were members of Black September, a Palestinian militant organization, and they entered the Olympic Village carrying weapons concealed in athletic bags. Within hours, 2 members of the Israeli Olympic team were dead, 9 more were held hostage in their apartments, and approximately 900 million people were watching the events unfold on live television. What happened next is one of the most comprehensive failures in the history of organized security response. The West German authorities had no dedicated counterterrorism unit, nor did any government anywhere in the world, because no government had yet conceived of the need for one. The snipers rushed to the Fürstenfeldbruck airfield, for the attempted rescue had no communication with each other, no body armor, no night vision equipment, and had been told there were 5 terrorists in the building when there were 8. They were ordinary marksmen handed an extraordinary problem with no preparation and no realistic chance of success. All 9 remaining hostages died. For approximately 1 hour afterward, news agencies around the world carried the story that the crisis had ended happily and the hostages were safe. Then the truth arrived, and with it a question that no Western government could ignore. If a catastrophe like this happened again, what exactly was anyone going to do about it? The answer to that question would define the next 50 years of warfare. In 1968, fewer than 11 international terrorist groups were operating worldwide. Within 5 years of Munich, that number had exceeded 50. The logic was brutal and simple. Terrorism worked. It commanded global attention, created political leverage, and demonstrated that the most powerful governments on Earth could be paralyzed by a small group of men with weapons and a willingness to die. The camera crews at Connollystrasse had handed terrorism something more valuable than any ransom demand. A worldwide audience of nearly 1 billion people, live and unedited. Every major Western power drew the same conclusion in the months that followed Munich. They needed something they did not yet have. The Americans faced a problem that was more than tactical. The Green Berets, the Army's special operations backbone, were organized and trained to do one primary thing, which was to build foreign armies. They went into allied nations, trained indigenous forces, and prepared those forces to fight. They were teachers. The Rangers were light infantry built for conventional raids on identified objectives. Both were formidable in the right circumstances. Neither could walk into a darkened aircraft at 2 in the morning and distinguish a terrorist from a hostage in the fraction of a second, available before the shot decision had to be made. The gap was not merely organizational. It was doctrinal, cultural, and institutional, and it had a long history of being pointed out by one man that nobody wanted to hear from. 5 years after Munich, on the 13th of October, 1977. 4 Palestinian terrorists hijacked Lufthansa Flight 181 en route from Mallorca to Frankfurt. The aircraft was diverted across multiple countries. The captain was murdered, and the plane ultimately landed in Mogadishu, Somalia, on where 86 hostages sat in the dark. The West German GSG-9 counterterrorism unit stormed the aircraft and freed the hostages. 3 terrorists were killed. 1 was captured. Every hostage survived. But the detail that matters most for this story is barely mentioned in most accounts of that rescue. 2 men from the British Special Air Service were present in an advisory capacity, providing tactical guidance. The stun grenades that blinded the terrorists in the critical opening seconds of the assault had been invented not in Germany, but in Hereford, England, by SAS operators whose names have never appeared in a history book. The most important innovation in the Mogadishu rescue was a British invention, delivered by British hands. The Pentagon watched the news coverage and understood, at last, what it had been refusing to understand since 1963. 4 days later, on November 19, 1977, the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta was officially established. It had taken Munich, Entebbe, Mogadishu, and 1 relentless colonel to force the admission. That colonel was Charles Alvin Beckwith, and his story begins not in a war, but on a football field. Born in Atlanta on January 22, 1929, to Baptist parents in a city still working out what kind of place it intended to be, Beckwith was an all-state football player by his teenage years and brought the same ferocious, headlong quality to everything he touched afterward. At the University of Georgia, he played for the Bulldogs, and somewhere in the draft discussions of 1950, the Green Bay Packers identified him as someone worth pursuing. He turned them down. The harder path was always the one worth walking, and professional football, whatever its demands, wasn't the harder path. The Army was. Commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in 1952, he fought in Korea, moved through the 82nd Airborne Division, completed Ranger School, and by 1958 had attached himself to the 7th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg. His nickname was Chargin Charlie. Nobody who knew him considered this ironic. In 1960, Captain Beckwith deployed to Laos for 2 years on a classified program of military advisors working with the Royal Laotian Army against communist insurgents. And Laos gave him his first sustained experience of what small teams could accomplish without the noise and signature of conventional military operations, and planted an observation he would spend decades developing into an argument. Then came the assignment that changed everything. In the summer of 1962, Beckwith and a Sergeant Rosniak were selected for an exchange program between the United States Army Special Forces and the British 22nd Special Air Service Regiment. The arrangement had been shaped between Colonel Edwards on the American side and an SAS officer named Lieutenant Colonel John Woodhouse on the British. The British would send men to Fort Bragg, the Americans would go to Hereford, and both sides would benefit. Beckwith arrived in England in June of that year, believing the knowledge transfer would flow in roughly equal measure in both directions. This belief lasted until the car turned through the gates at Bradbury Lines. Major Dare Newell, the SAS adjutant, had collected Beckwith and his family from London and driven them west through the green English countryside toward Hereford. Several SAS officers and their wives were waiting at the quarters. The welcome was genuine and warm, and Beckwith registered that immediately. He felt comfortable in these surroundings, he would later write, even surrounded by men from Cornwall and Wales and Glasgow, whose accents required considerable effort to parse. Then the orientation began, and within his first week at Bradbury Lines, the comfortable feeling gave way to something more complicated. In the American Army of 1962, The relationship between officers and non-commissioned officers was governed by a hierarchy as formally understood as any institution could produce. Officers issued orders. NCOs implemented them. The precision of saluting, the polish of boots, the crease in the uniform, these were not incidental to military professionalism. They were its daily expression. At Bradbury Lines, none of this applied. Officers and sergeants called each other by their first names. Once a week, all ranks gathered in sessions that ran through the night, officers and NCOs together across every grade, to argue about tactics, challenge each other's thinking, and advance whatever idea was actually best, regardless of the shoulder rank behind it. A sergeant could tell a major he was wrong, and the major would engage the argument on its merits. Beckwith had not encountered anything like it in 2 decades of service. His first instinct was that he was looking at an organization that had confused informality with discipline. The barracks rooms were not maintained to any standard he recognized. The men had hair that would have produced a corrective interview at Fort Bragg. He was assigned to command 3 troop, a squadron, and what he found there appeared, by every measure he had been trained to apply, like a controlled disaster. He was a hotshot Green Beret captain, his own description, overflowing with the cockiness of youth, and the troop in front of him looked like something had gone wrong with military standards a long time ago, and nobody had fixed it. He was looking at it entirely wrong. The SAS had made a decision, when at some point in its institutional life, about where intensity genuinely mattered and where it was simply expensive. Polishing boots mattered in ceremonial regiments. In a regiment whose men spent months in jungles and deserts and locations that could not appear in their service records, that investment returned nothing. The informality of the barracks was not slackness. It was the careful preservation of human energy for the places where human energy was actually tested. When Beckwith saw what happened when the exercises began, when the regiment left the barracks for the hills, or the range, or the jungle, the realization arrived with the force of a physical correction. These men trained with a seriousness that made every American exercise he had attended look like a rehearsal for some other war. The field standard was absolute, unforgiving, and real in a way that no scripted training scenario could replicate. There was something else, harder to name and more important to understand. The men around him possessed a quality that was not reducible to any single characteristic he could point to. They were not physically larger than American soldiers, or obviously faster. They were self-contained. They moved through the world as if it required something from them rather than owed them something. Years later, Beckwith would write that what the regiment produced were men who enjoyed being alone, who could think and operate by themselves, men who were strong-minded and resolute. The critical thing he had not yet grasped was that the SAS had not manufactured this quality through training. The SAS had selected for it. The selection was specifically designed to identify men who already possessed that inner architecture, and then build skills on top of it. The American Army recruited men and hoped to develop character alongside capability. The SAS considered that sequence backwards. Then came the beret, and the lesson it carried. In the American Special Operations community, the Green Beret was issued to every officer on arrival at his unit, a symbol of membership granted at the moment of belonging. The sand-colored beret of the SAS was worn only after passing selection. An officer arrived at Bradbury Lines without it, and earned one through demonstrated performance, or returned to his parent unit without it. The distinction sounds administrative. It was not. Beckwith spent his first weeks working towards something he had always assumed was his by right, and discovered in the process that assuming a right and earning one were experiences so different they barely occupied the same moral category. In the autumn of that year, the exchange tour moved from the English hills to the jungles of Malaya. The SAS was operating along the Thai-Malaya border against remnants of the communist insurgency, and the deployment was not theoretical. Beckwith went in with men who had been fighting in that jungle for years, who had built the techniques of deep penetration patrol work through decades of hard use. 4-man patrols, weeks without resupply, intelligence accumulated through patience and observation rather than through force and firepower. The 4-man unit was the fundamental building block, 4 men who knew each other with the intimacy of close brothers, who could operate in absolute silence for days, who carried precisely what was necessary and nothing that was not. Then the leptospirosis arrived, a bacterial infection transmitted through contaminated water. Leptospirosis attacks the kidneys and liver in its severe form and can cause pulmonary hemorrhaging and organ failure. The British medical team who assessed Beckwith gave him 3 weeks to live. He was offered evacuation to an American military hospital in the region, familiar surroundings, familiar medicine, a better-equipped facility. He refused. He chose to remain within the SAS's care, to recover among the men he had come to serve alongside, to prove by that refusal that his belonging was not conditional on his comfort. The SAS registered the decision. Something shifted in the relationship at that moment that could not be reversed. He recovered. When the regiment acknowledged his time with them and presented him with the earned sand-colored beret, Beckwith later wrote that it meant more to him than any decoration the American Army had given him. Going home, he carried that beret and a conviction already hardening into certainty. He knew, as clearly as he had ever known anything, that he had stumbled upon a concept, a way of building soldiers and units and selecting for the qualities that actually determined who survived in the places where those questions were settled. He had seen the future operating in a Malaysian jungle. Nobody wanted to hear about it. The proposal was submitted in 1963. The Army's response was polite and unambiguous, since the existing structure was adequate. He submitted it again. Same answer. Again. Same answer. For the better part of a decade, Beckwith pressed the case through every channel available to him against a bureaucratic resistance that was not merely indifferent, but actively uncomfortable with the implication, which was that the American Special Operations Community, as currently constituted, was capable of teaching, but not of doing. The proposal gathered dust in filing systems, while the world outside the Pentagon continued preparing problems that no one inside it had the right answer for. Vietnam consumed the middle years of his career. He went back in 1965 to command Project Delta, Operational Detachment B-52, where he applied everything he had absorbed from the SAS to build and lead long-range reconnaissance teams doing. And in the Southeast Asian jungle, something very close to what he had seen in Malaya. He hand-picked every man. He ran his own selection. The results stood apart from what American units in the same theater were achieving. In early 1966, a .50 caliber round passed through his abdomen, a wound the medical personnel who assessed him considered unsurvivable. They were wrong. He recovered, returned to service, rewrote the Florida phase of Ranger School, went back to Vietnam, and continued filing proposals that continued to be declined. Munich changed the political mathematics. Entebbe in July of 1976, where Israeli commandos flew 4,000 kilometers to Uganda and rescued 102 hostages in 90 minutes, demonstrated what a precision unit could accomplish when properly built, properly supported, and given the autonomy to execute without committee oversight. Mogadishu in October of 1977 delivered the terminal argument. 11 days after the GSG-9 rescue, the Pentagon gave Beckwith his authorization. He had been making the same case since 1963, The patience required to sustain that conviction through 14 years of institutional rejection, 2 near-fatal wounds, and a war that ended badly is not a quality that appears in most military biographies. While Beckwith fought the American bureaucracy for over a decade, the British were building something at their Hereford headquarters that no one outside the regiment's gates had yet seen. Munich struck the SAS with the same force it struck every Western military, but the response was different in kind. The regiment's leadership asked a question that other militaries avoided. If something like Munich happened on British soil, could the SAS respond effectively? In 1972, the honest answer was no. The SAS was built for jungle patrol and behind-lines reconnaissance, and had no dedicated close-quarters hostage rescue capability whatsoever. That admission produced what may be the most consequential institutional decision in the history of counterterrorism. The Counter-Revolutionary Warfare Wing was established in the early 1970s to create the capability from scratch. The CRW Wing did not adapt existing doctrine. It invented an entirely new technical discipline, advanced pistol shooting for the 3 to 5 meter engagements of a hostage environment, explosive entry methods, room-clearing procedures that coordinated multiple operators moving simultaneously through multiple entry points, each responsible for a precisely defined sector, each operating on the knowledge that every person in the room was either a hostage to be protected or a threat to be engaged, and that the time available to determine which was measured in fractions of a second. The facility built to train this discipline was at Stirling Lines, the SAS's Hereford headquarters, and it was called the Killing House, a 2-story building with 4 rooms on each level, designed to look exactly like a conventional dwelling. Furniture in every room, pictures on the walls, working plumbing. The walls were coated in special rubber to absorb live rounds. Extractor fans cleared the fumes from repeated live fire drills. Video cameras in every corner recorded every exercise for the forensic after-action review that followed each session. Not simunitions, not reduced-power training ammunition. Live rounds, fired in an enclosed space, at targets placed among simulated hostages, at speeds that made every existing American training facility look like a rehearsal for a different kind of warfare. The pistol standard the CRW Wing developed around the Killing House was not marksmanship in any conventional sense. 2 shots, landing within a zone the size of a playing card, from 3 to 5 meters, in under a second from stimulus to second round, sustained across an entire training session, regardless of the operator's heart rate, the quality of the light, or the movement of the target. The Americans called that kind of shooting elite. The SAS called it the minimum acceptable standard for walking through a door where people were being held at gunpoint. Below that standard, you were not an asset in the building. You were an additional danger. The Operations Research Wing, a small cell of experienced SAS veterans tasked with developing new equipment, produced the innovation that would do more to change counterterrorism practice than any other single invention. The stun grenade, a device that generates approximately 300,000 candela of light and 170 decibels of sound in a controlled burst, designed to exploit the human visual system's reset delay, the fraction of a second after extreme stimulation, during which the eye cannot process new information. A person in a room when a stun grenade detonates has approximately half a second of complete sensory disruption. In the mathematics of a hostage rescue, half a second is the difference between a clean assault and a catastrophe. The stun grenade is carried today by police tactical units and military counterterrorism forces on every inhabited continent. It was designed in Hereford by men whose names remain classified. Not just the grenade, not just the pistol doctrine. By November of 1977, The SAS had been refining these capabilities for 5 years, had deployed them at Mogadishu, and had spent the preceding year conducting operations in Northern Ireland against the Provisional IRA, the most demanding urban counterterrorism environment on Earth. They were not a young unit discovering what worked. They were an old regiment that had long since discarded everything that did not. It was into this accumulated institutional knowledge that the first Delta Force operators arrived in 1978. The car turned through the gates at Stirling Lines on a gray English morning, and the American in the front passenger seat, a Ranger captain selected through Delta's long walk and the psychological board that followed it, a man who had earned every credential the American Special Operations community could offer, looked through the windscreen and felt his expectations begin to fail him within the first 30 seconds. The first man visible in the car park was leaning against a battered civilian vehicle. Long hair, no uniform, no rank visible anywhere on his person. He looked up and assessed the new arrivals with a glance that was professionally brief and impersonally thorough, and went back to his newspaper. The American's first instinct was that they had the wrong address. The introductions were made, the quarters were shown, the first briefings began. And in those initial hours, the SAS started the quiet dismantling of everything the Delta contingent understood about what military excellence looked like and how it was built. Officers called NCOs by their first names. NCOs called officers by their first names. The weekly sessions where all ranks gathered to argue about tactics, no hierarchy in the room, just men and problems, and the standard that the best solution won regardless of whose stripe it came from, were unlike anything in the American experience. The Army ran authority downward and information upward. The SAS ran both in all directions simultaneously and expected every man capable of contributing to either. Within the first week, the casual car and the long hair were recontextualized by what the Americans saw when the regiment went to work. The informality was not a failure of professional standards. It was a deliberate allocation of energy, a decision made at some level of the institution's development that the things most armies spent considerable effort maintaining were not the things that determined whether soldiers came home. The SAS had identified where professionalism actually manifested and concentrated itself there. The killing house, the range, the hills. Everywhere else, the energy was available for other purposes. The first morning on the range produced the first genuine reckoning. The American had qualified at the top of every marksmanship standard the U.S. military had devised. He stood at the Stirling Lines range and watched an SAS corporal run the close-quarters pistol drill, the double tap to a playing card-sized zone at 5 meters, under a second, from stimulus to second shot, repeated across multiple positions and angles, without any degradation in the standard, and understood within the first 2 repetitions that he was watching something categorically different from what he had been trained to do. Not better marksmanship, a different activity entirely, which happened to involve a firearm. The corporal did not pause to acknowledge the gap. He demonstrated the drill slowly, then at speed, then explained the mechanical and psychological components, and waited for the work to begin. The killing house was the day the Americans stopped measuring the gap and started measuring the distance to the other side. The building looked ordinary from outside. Then the doors opened, and the smell arrived first, propellant and rubber, and something metallic that settled at the back of the throat. The rooms were furnished with the specificity of an actual dwelling. Chairs, tables, objects on shelves, a television in the corner. Metal target silhouettes stood at various positions throughout the furniture, some marked as threats and some as hostages, and the distinction between them was not always immediately obvious at the speed at which the entry team would be moving. The SAS team entered for the demonstration, and what happened in the following seconds had no framework in the Americans' previous experience. Two men at the door, the stun grenade through the window, the crack of light and sound that arrived and was gone before the mind registered it, had happened, and in the half-second of sensory disruption that followed, the door was open, and the team was inside, and moving, and the shots were fired, and it was over. Every threat silhouette had been hit. Every hostage silhouette was untouched. The entire sequence from the first detonation to the last round had lasted approximately 8 seconds. 8 seconds. For every person in that building who was not meant to die, those 8 seconds were the margin between their life and everything else. The precision was real and verifiable, and in that sense, remarkable. But what stopped the American in the doorway afterward was something beyond precision. It was the integration. Speed, communication, or target discrimination at full movement, and an absolute absence of hesitation between the decision and the act. These were not men performing a drill they had memorized. They were men executing something they had done so many thousands of times that it had passed through the stage of conscious skill and arrived in the place where the body does the correct thing before the mind has finished deciding what the correct thing is. He stood in that room for a long moment, and the silence was the silence of a man whose understanding of what human beings could be trained to do had just been permanently expanded. The selection conversation came later that week, in an exchange with an SAS warrant officer who explained with patient precision what the Hills phase of selection was actually designed to measure. The long drag, 40 miles through the Brecon beacons with a 55-pound Bergen, to be completed in under 20 hours, was not, the warrant officer said, the test. It looked like the test. It was, in the physical sense, indisputably a test. But the Hills phase was primarily a diagnostic tool for something that had nothing to do with physical endurance. No feedback was given to candidates at any point during the course. The directing staff told no one how they were performing, whether they were ahead of the time limit or behind it, whether they were meeting the standard or failing it. The candidate who passed was the one who could bear that silence, who could function without external validation, without the psychological scaffolding of encouragement or information, without knowing whether his effort was sufficient, someone make correct small decisions throughout, hour after hour, in the dark, alone, on terrain that did not care whether he had prepared. Delta's selection had been built on the same structural framework, the same increasing weights, the same unknown time limits, the same absent feedback. What the warrant officer described revealed the layer beneath the framework. The long drag was not selecting for the man who could walk 40 miles. A serious athlete could walk 40 miles. The Hills were selecting for the man who could sustain correct judgment under conditions of radical, indefinite uncertainty. And the physical suffering was the most efficient mechanism available for creating those conditions in a reliable and reproducible way. The Americans had built a physical selection. The British had built a psychological one and dressed it in boots so that you would not know the difference until you were already somewhere past the point of turning back. In the evenings, in the regiment's mess, the conversations with SAS troopers added dimensions that the range and the killing house had not provided. These were men who had been in Dhofar, men who had spent months in Northern Ireland, conducting operations in densely populated environments against a sophisticated domestic adversary. Men who talked about failure, specific patrol decisions that had been wrong, moments when the doctrine had not answered the problem, and improvisation had been the only remaining option, with a directness that had no counterpart in the American military culture of the 1970s. Failure in the SAS was information. Every failure carried a lesson, and every lesson had a practical application. And the refusal to examine failure honestly was the most expensive form of institutional pride available. One detail from the original 1962 exchange had circulated through Delta since its founding, and the American thought about it more than once during his time at Stirling Lines. Dick Meadows, Beckwith's companion on that first visit, had not merely trained with the SAS and returned to America with new knowledge. Meadows had married the daughter of an SAS sergeant major. A Green Beret had been claimed so completely by this institution, by its culture and its people, and the way it understood what soldiers were for, that he had made it his family. The regiment had a gravity. It pulled at certain men. It found something in them that they hadn't known was there and named it, and then gave them a context in which that thing was the most important thing about them. The American returned to Fort Bragg with a report. Beckwith read it with the attention of a man who had been waiting since 1963 for confirmation delivered in words that someone who had not been to Hereford could finally understand. The report described the killing house, and the pistol standard, and the selection philosophy, and the culture of the weekly session, and the meaning of the earned beret. Beckwith had known all of it. But between what he was building at Fort Bragg and what the SAS had at Stirling Lines, there remained a gap measured not in doctrine or equipment, but in the one thing that could not be borrowed or accelerated: time. Decades of building and failing and learning from failure. He had been given 2 years. The formal proposal for Delta's structure laid out the 4-phase selection and assessment process in terms drawn directly from the SAS model. The physical phase, the psychological assessment, the technical training, the operational evaluation. Brigadier John Watts, the British officer who had advised Beckwith during the planning phase, had told him to ask for 24 months and not let anyone talk him out of it. Beckwith asked for 24 months and held the line against every attempt to reduce it. Standing in direct institutional competition with Delta throughout this period was Blue Light, a unit created from the 5th Special Forces Group to fill the counterterrorism gap while Delta was being assembled, and by its existence arguing that the gap did not require what Beckwith was building. Blue Light was staffed by capable men. The argument it represented, that the existing special operations architecture with modifications could handle the counterterrorism mission, was the argument the Pentagon had found comfortable for over a decade. Beckwith's counter-argument was everything he had seen at Stirling Lines. A unit capable of executing what Delta needed to execute could not be assembled by adjusting what already existed. It had to be built from first principles, around a selection designed to find the right person first and develop that person's skills second. Delta Force was certified as fully mission-capable in the autumn of 1979. Beckwith had his unit, not the decades of accumulated knowledge, on not the killing house replicated to the SAS's standard or the CQB doctrine refined through 5 years of live-fire repetition, but a unit built on the right principles, populated by the right people, with a realistic chance of doing the job the country was about to need it for. On November 4, 1979, 52 American diplomats and citizens were taken hostage inside the United States Embassy in Tehran. The clock that had been running since Beckwith first walked through the Bradbury lines, Gates had just reached 0. In the days before the launch of Operation Eagle Claw, President Jimmy Carter met privately with Beckwith. He walked over to the colonel and spoke words that deserved to be recorded exactly as Beckwith later reported them. Tell them that in the event this operation fails, for whatever reason, and the fault will not be theirs, it will be mine. The President of the United States was taking personal responsibility for a military mission's potential failure on the eve of that mission. The room was quiet when he said it. Operation Eagle Claw launched on the night of April 24, 1980. The mission required 6 functional helicopters from a contingent of 8. 3 suffered mechanical failures before reaching the forward staging area in the Iranian desert. Beckwith made the decision to abort. During the subsequent withdrawal, a helicopter maneuvering in darkness collided with a CD-130 transport aircraft on the ground. 8 Americans died in the fire. The hostages remained in Tehran. 11 days earlier, the SAS had conducted the operation that would define it for a generation, for 6 Iranian terrorists had seized the Iranian embassy in London on April 30th, taking 26 hostages. After 6 days of negotiation, a hostage was killed and his body thrown from the building. Margaret Thatcher authorized the assault. The SAS came in from the roof, simultaneous entry through multiple points, stun grenades through the glass, 17 minutes from the first detonation to the last shot. 5 of the 6 terrorists were killed. All but 1 hostage was rescued. The entire raid unfolded live on British television during peak viewing hours on a bank holiday Monday, and by midnight, the regiment was among the most famous military units in the world. Eagle Claw failed. Nimrod succeeded. The units involved were not strangers to each other. Delta's operators had trained at Stirling Lines, and the SAS had helped teach them. What the outcomes reflected was not a difference in the quality of the men. Delta's operators were among the finest soldiers America had produced. The gap was institutional and temporal, the difference between a unit certified for 30 days and a regiment that had been building, failing, and rebuilding since 1941. An SAS officer, when asked about Beckwith and the desert, said something that deserves its permanent place in the record. Charlie was the best that any army could produce. The difference is that we were operating in our own backyard. He was operating over thousands of miles. Lady Luck was with us. She let him down. The failure of Eagle Claw completed what Beckwith had been trying to build. The Senate investigations that followed, substantially shaped by his recommendations, and it produced the Joint Special Operations Command, the architectural framework that brought Delta, the newly founded SEAL Team 6, and their aviation and intelligence support into a coordinated national capability. The 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment was established specifically to provide aviation support that met the standard of the operators it was supporting, because Eagle Claw had demonstrated in the most expensive currency available what happens when the chain is strong in one place and weak in another. Every structural feature of the modern American counterterrorism capability traces its institutional lineage to the lessons learned in the Iranian desert on that night, in April of 1980. The SAS had understood for decades what Eagle Claw proved by negative example. The unit is only as capable as its least prepared element, and a selection standard applied to the assault team and not to its support is a standard that will eventually fail at the point of its weakest application. The visible evidence of what passed between Hereford and Fort Bragg is present today in every serious counterterrorism program on Earth. The shoot house, the killing house concept, reproduced now in dozens of countries, each version a descendant of the original at Stirling Lines. The stun grenade, carried by police tactical units from Oslo to Sao Paulo to Seoul, descended from the device invented in Hereford. The 4-man patrol as the fundamental unit of special operations, refined in the Malayan jungle and inherited by every serious special operations force that followed. The psychological selection, the deliberate absence of feedback, the unknown standard, the measurement of the candidate's capacity to function under radical uncertainty, replicated from Australia's Special Air Service Regiment to Norway's Forsvarets Special Commando, to Israel's Sayeret Matkal. Delta's 4-squadron structure mirrors the SAS's 4 Sabre squadrons exactly. The flat hierarchy, the relaxed grooming standards, the culture in which demonstrated competence carries more authority than the rank on a shoulder, all of it imported from Bradbury lines, adapted to American institutional reality, and embedded in the unit that would go on to hunt Saddam Hussein's sons in Mosul and pursue high-value targets in the mountains of Afghanistan. The two units still train together. They have deployed together in places whose names appear in classified documents rather than history books. The exchange program that two officers shaped in the early 1960s, an arrangement built on the simple recognition that each side had something the other needed, has never formally ended. What was transferred between the SAS and Delta Force across those years of exchange and instruction and borrowed experience was not primarily a collection of tactical innovations, though the innovations were real and consequential and in daily use. The deeper transfer was a philosophy, the conviction, demonstrated through decades of practice and failure and rebuilding, that the quality of the individual soldier is the only thing that ultimately matters in the kind of warfare where a single wrong decision kills the people you have been sent to save. That this quality cannot be manufactured through training alone. That finding it requires a selection process ruthless enough to reflect the ruthlessness of the situations it is preparing men for. Both units nearly did not exist. The SAS was disbanded in 1945 and barely survived its resurrection 7 years later. Delta was blocked for over a decade by an institution that confused what it already had with what it actually needed. In both cases, the arguments against were the same: too expensive, too autonomous, not compatible with established doctrine. In both cases, those arguments were wrong in the most permanent way available. So Beckwith turned down the Green Bay Packers in 1950 and chose the harder thing. He had no way of knowing how hard it would become. He survived leptospirosis and a .50 caliber round in 14 years of institutional rejection and a catastrophe in the desert, and built in 2 years, from principles he had absorbed in a British barracks in the summer of 1962, the unit that would reshape the practice of counterterrorism for the next half-century. He died in June of 1994. The institution he built remains operational. The relationship he forged between Hereford and Fort Bragg has not broken. When those first Delta operators drove through the gates at Stirling Lines and saw a man in civilian clothes with long hair reading a newspaper against a battered car, they thought they had the wrong address. They thought the men inside could not possibly be what they had traveled to find. They were wrong in ways they would spend the rest of their careers grateful to have been wrong about. They had arrived at exactly the right place, the most consequential address in the history of American special operations. They just did not know it yet. Now you do.